I keep the sack in my truck bed still. Empty now, washed out 3 times over, hung to dry on the tailgate till the sun took the smell out of it. And I can still feel that meal between my fingers when I close my eyes at night. Still feel how soft it was, softer than any flower has a right to be. That's the part that won't let me sleep right. Not the wheel turning on its own out there in the dark. Not the sound of stone grinding on stone when the creek had gone near dry as a bone. Just how gentle that meal felt in my palm, right before I understood what it had been ground from. Let me take you back. Let me take you back slow, the way these things always start slow. Long before Wyatt Colson understood what he'd walked into, and long before anybody up in Quern Hollow bothered to warn him proper. Wyatt was a structural engineer, the kind who'd made a small, specialized name for himself, assessing old water-powered mills for restoration grants and historical trusts. It's particular work. Most engineers won't touch a building that old, built on foundations nobody drew up on paper, held together by joinery a man worked out in his head 200 years back. Wyatt liked it precisely because it was particular. He liked walking into a structure everybody else had written off and telling them with numbers whether it could still stand. The call came from a young couple, Tom and Grace Merrick, who'd bought 60 acres in an old stone gristmill at a county auction that spring. Sight mostly unseen, the way people do when a listing photo catches something in them they can't quite name. They wanted to turn the mill into a bakery and cider house, grind their own flour, sell it out of the old building to weekend tourists driving the scenic byway. Before the county would touch their renovation permit, they needed an engineer's report. Wyatt drove down in the last week of September to give them one. The drive down into Quern Hollow took the better part of an hour once the state route gave way to gravel, the truck rocking slow over washboard ruts that hadn't seen a grader in a long season. Hickory and black walnut crowded in tighter the deeper the road went, until the canopy closed overhead and the light came down thin and gray gold, filtered the way mountain light gets when it's had to work for its way to the ground. Wyatt didn't pass another vehicle the whole way in. Not a mailbox with a flag up, not a porch light left burning against the coming evening. Quern Hollow, when the trees finally opened, was just a widening along the creek and a scatter of old foundations gone soft with disuse, the mill sitting at the center of it like it was still keeping time for a schedule nobody else remembered. Quern Hollow sat where Sift Creek folded back on itself twice before it widened out toward the valley. A narrow run of land pinched between 2 ridge lines that kept the light thin and slanted even at midday. The mill stood at the second fold, a squat building of fitted fieldstone with a wheel on its downhill side, the wood gone silver gray with age, half the paddles patched with newer lumber that hadn't weathered to match. It was called the Odom Mill by the handful of families who still lived close enough up the hollow to remember it running. Ezra Odom had kept it for the better part of 40 years, grinding corn and wheat for 3 counties, until one autumn he simply wasn't there to open it anymore. Nobody Wyatt talked to could say exactly what year that was. The stories didn't agree, which he found strange for a fact that specific. The drought that September had dropped Sift Creek to a trickle, barely enough flow to wet the mossy base of the wheel, nowhere near enough to turn it. That was the first thing Wyatt noted in his file, the kind of dry, procedural observation his reports were built from. Insufficient headwater. Wheel non-operational under current conditions. He photographed the sluice gate, rusted shut, chained the way the county had left it decades back when they condemned the structure for public use. He noted the millstones inside, a pair of great gray discs nearly 5 feet across, and moved on to the joists. He came back to the mill before dawn the next morning to catch the light for his photographs. And that's when he heard it. A low grinding, stone against stone, coming from inside a building with a chained gate and a creak too thin to turn a child's pinwheel. He stood in the wet grass a long minute before he made himself go in. The wheel was still. The sluice gate was still chained. But the stones, when he laid his palm flat against them, were warm, and a fine gray dust sat heaped in a small, careful mound where the meal spout led out onto the floor, like somebody had swept it there on purpose and simply hadn't come back yet to bag it. Wyatt told himself it was residue, old flour disturbed by mice, maybe settled loose by the vibration of his own footsteps on the floorboards. He wrote it down as unexplained residue in his notes, the way you write down anything you can't account for and don't yet want to think too hard about. And he went on with his measurements. Now, before I go any further with this one, I want to say hello to some of you properly. The ones who've walked this hollow with me a good many times now, and the ones only just now finding the porch light on for the first time tonight. My name is Silas Vance. Most folks just call me Abe. If you're new to us, go on and tap that subscribe button so you don't lose the trail back here. Now hush down a little, because Wyatt Colson was about to learn something that mill wasn't in the business of teaching to a man who'd only come to look at the stones. There's a woman who lives up the ridge above the mill, name of Opal Sadler, who Wyatt went to see that same afternoon, mostly because hers was the only chimney he'd spotted with smoke coming out of it since he'd driven into the hollow. Her place sat back off a gravel track behind a stand of black walnut, and she came to the porch rail before he'd even cut his engine, like she'd been watching the road a while already. She was well past 80, small and sharp-eyed, and she looked at him a long moment before she asked whether he'd been down at the Odom place. He said he had. She told him to come sit then, because a man who'd already been down there needed to hear a few things before he went back. Inside, Opal's kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something baking low in the oven, and a cat with one clouded eye watched Wyatt from a chair by the window the whole time he sat there. She poured him coffee he hadn't asked for, the way hollow women of a certain age tend to do for a stranger they've already decided is worth the trouble. And she talked to him slow, taking her time getting to the parts that mattered, the way a story gets told when the teller has heard it told before her 100 times and knows better than to rush it. Opal's grandfather had worked the mill as a young man, hauling sacks for old Ezra Odom back before her own mother was born. She said the family always kept the same rule about that mill, passed down the way rules get passed down in a hollow like this one, mouth to mouth, generation folded into generation, until nobody remembers who said it first. Sweep the floor, salt the door, let the meal lie. What the wheel grinds on its own is not for a bag, and it is not for a pie. She said her grandfather used to say it under his breath every single morning before he opened that mill, the same way another man might say a blessing over his coffee, out of habit more than belief, until the morning it stopped being habit and started being the only thing standing between him and whatever the mill decided to grind next. Wyatt asked her, careful, what she meant by that. Opal told him the mill had always ground more than corn, if you let it run long enough on its own, unwatched, unfed. She said her grandfather never explained exactly what the extra meal was made from. She said he didn't have the words for it, or didn't want the words for it, only that it wasn't right to take home, wasn't right to eat, wasn't right to so much as touch bare-handed if you could help it. Sweep it into the tail race. Let the creek carry it off. Never bag it. Never let it cross your own threshold. Because a man's threshold is the one place in this world that still belongs to him. And the moment you carry that meal across it, you've told the mill you don't mind sharing. Wyatt drove back down to the Odom mill, turning that over in his mind the way a practical man turns over a story he doesn't believe and can't quite dismiss either. He was there for engineering, not folklore. His report needed a materials assessment regardless, an actual determination of whether that dust on the floor was ground stone, meaning the burr stones themselves were degrading and posed a structural hazard worth flagging, or whether it was old grain residue, meaning someone, somehow, had been running that mill more recently than the county's own condemnation record suggested. Either finding mattered for his report. Either finding was something a materials lab back in the city could settle in an afternoon with the right equipment. That was the reasoning Wyatt gave himself, standing in that mill with an empty sample bag already half open in his hand. It felt like due diligence. It felt like exactly the kind of unglamorous, careful verification his whole career was built on. The instinct that had made him good at this work in the first place. When you find something you can't explain, you don't guess at it. You collect it. You test it. You get the real answer instead of the comfortable one. He scooped a small measure of the meal into the bag, sealed it, and labeled it in his own careful hand. Sample 1, Odom Mill, origin unknown. He didn't hear Opal's voice in his head until much later that night. Never let it cross your own threshold. He'd already carried it into his rental truck by then. He'd already driven it 2 miles up the county road to the cabin he'd booked for the week, and set it, without thinking twice, on the kitchen table just inside his own front door. That first night, nothing happened that Wyatt could point to directly, except that he slept poorly and woke twice to a sound he couldn't place, faint and rhythmic, like 2 flat stones being drawn slow across each other somewhere outside his hearing rather than inside it. In the morning, the sample bag sat exactly where he'd left it. He told himself that settled it. Nothing wrong with a little dust. The second night he woke at some hour he never checked, to a fine gray powder dusted across his windowsill, on the inside of the glass, where no draft could have carried it. He wiped it away with his thumb before he'd fully thought about what he was doing. And it felt exactly like the meal from the mill floor, soft as talc, faintly sweet the way old grain gets when it's turning. By the third morning it was in his coffee tin, a thin gray layer sitting on top of the grounds, undisturbed, like it had simply been there all along and he'd only now noticed. He checked the sample bag on the table. Still sealed. Still, as far as he could tell, exactly the amount he'd scooped that first afternoon. He drove back to the mill that day, meaning to return it, to pour it back into the tail race the way Opal had told him, to undo whatever small, reasonable mistake he'd made in the name of a materials report nobody was ever going to read as closely as he was reading his own kitchen table now. He stood at the mill door with the sealed bag in his hand a long while before he made himself go in, because the wheel was turning, slow, patient, with a creak too thin to explain it, the paddles dipping into 3 inches of water and lifting clear, over and over, the way a hand turns pages it already knows by heart. He poured the meal back through the spout the way it had come, every grain of it, and swept the floor after, and salted the door the way Opal had shown him with a fistful from her own kitchen tin. He told himself that was the end of it. A misstep corrected. A rule learned the hard way and then respected. But a threshold, once crossed, doesn't uncross itself just because you're sorry after. Wyatt finished his field work and drove home 3 counties over, back to his own house, back to his own life, the way a man does when he's decided the sensible thing is distance and routine. For a stretch of days, that seemed to be enough. He filed his report, noted the residue as inconclusive pending further sampling, recommended a follow-up visit before any renovation work began near the stones, and left it at that. The closest thing to an honest answer his profession would let him put in writing. Then, on a morning he wasn't expecting anything at all, he found a thin gray dusting across his own kitchen counter in a house 200 miles from Quern Hollow, on a morning when he hadn't opened a window or a door before the sun came up. He still finds it sometimes, not every day, not even every week. A soft gray trace along a windowsill, a faint scent of turning grain in a cabinet that's never held flour. He says the worst part isn't the fear of it anymore, not exactly. It's the ordinariness of the days between. The way a man can go on making coffee and mowing his yard and sitting on his porch some evenings with the dust of something unnamed still settled somewhere in his house, and call that living. Because what other choice is there? He hasn't been back to Quern Hollow. He thinks about it sometimes, driving down there and boarding up that spot for good, sealing the whole building in concrete if the county would allow it. But he says a man who's spent his career studying old mills knows something most people don't stop to consider. A wheel doesn't need much water to keep turning once it's decided to. Just enough. And the Odom mill, dry season or wet, has never once run out of just enough. Before I let this one go quiet, I want to say it plain, one more time, the way I try to at the close of every file. My name is Silas Vance, and around here, most everybody just calls me Abe. If tonight's the first night you sat with us, I hope this hollow treated you gentle, and I hope you'll come sit with us again. So if you ever find yourself standing over a set of stones that are grinding when they've got no earthly business grinding, I'd ask you to remember Wyatt Colson, and to remember Quern Hollow, and to leave whatever falls exactly where it lands. Don't reach for the bag. Whatever that mill is short on, whatever it seems to be waiting on somebody to carry home for it, it was never asking for a sample. It was asking for a tithe. The hollow's quiet now, the way it gets this time of night. And somewhere down along Sift Creek, The Odom mill is still standing, gate chained, stones cool for now, waiting on water that isn't coming, and turning anyway when nobody's there to see it. Rest easy tonight. Let the wheel keep its own hours for a while longer. This has been the Redacted Archives. I'm Silas Vance. Folks call me Abe. Sleep easy, and I'll see you at the next file.